Hi Fivermar, I hope you're all doing okay. You've absolutely smashed it this week. You've used your grit power and your emerald power just like I thought you would do. So the point of today's video is for those children who didn't get a chance to connect with us on the 1 o'clock live videos on Thursday and Friday. So I'm going to read the part of the book that we read in those sessions so you can catch up like everybody else. Okay, so far, just to catch you up, it's been a little while since you've probably heard the book for a while. So far, they've promised their parents that they would not read a single newspaper, and whenever reporters approach them because of everything that happened, they have to say no comment. So we're at that point now. I was feeling that second type of scared again now, and it made me want to be sick all over the floor. I had never thought that the greatest idea in the world would get us into trouble with the police. I never ever imagined it would get Amit in trouble too. I didn't want him to feel angry at us. But what if he hated us for not telling him our plan, and for the news people knowing about him, even though we hadn't meant to? "Come on," said Josie, putting an arm over my shoulder, and together we walked in silence up to Miss Sanders' office. I took a deep breath and, feeling for the worst, opened the door. But instead of angry stares and shaking heads, we found everyone smiling at us. Mrs. Khan ran up and gave us all a hug. And so did Miss Hemsey, and Amit looked at us with his wide lion eyes and gave us a small wave. His foster mum was holding her hands to her lips as if she was praying and saying, "You dear children." And there were 2 police officers standing near the door, but they didn't look angry either and just nodded and smiled at us. "Come and sit down," said Mrs. Khan, leading us to 4 chairs that had been squeezed in front of Mrs. Sanders' desk. We all sat down. I was still feeling jumpy inside, but at least I wasn't feeling sick anymore. "As soon as Mrs. Sanders gets back, we want to hear all about what happened yesterday," said Mrs. Khan. "Miss Hemsey will translate everything for Amit. And we want you to take your time because it's all very, very important." "But miss, what about first period?" whispered Michael, showing her his watch as if it started flashing a blue colour. Just as he held it up, the bell rang for registration. Mrs. Khan smiled. "Don't worry, Miss Stevens is taking the class this morning." We immediately felt sorry for everyone in class. Miss Stevens is learning to be a teacher, but she's so boring and spends all her time writing on the board that everybody hopes that she will never become one. Mrs. Sanders came in and, squeezing past everyone, sat down in her big chair that had a squashed green velvet pillow on it. "Right," she said, clapping her hands. "Begin." Slowly at first, and then getting faster and faster, we began to talk. We talked about how we became friends with Amit and how we wanted to help after finding out where his mum and dad might be. We talked about hearing about the border gates were going to be shut and all the plans that we had come up with to help. I could see that Miss Hemsey explaining everything to Amit as we went, and his eyes kept getting wider and wider. But it wasn't until I got out my exercise book and showed everybody the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan that he jumped up from his seat and came to stand next to me. Mrs. Hemsey had to stand up too as we continued to talk about the letter to the Queen and the presents we were meant to give her, and Stan the taxi man, and Devinda the paramedic, and the extra special Coldstream guards who had given us their word. Nobody asked us any questions. Not even one. They all just sat and listened and nodded as Mrs. Hemsey murmured what they were saying in Amit's ear. It was strange having so many grown-ups sit and listen, as if we were them and they were us, but it felt good too. When we had said everything there was to say, Mrs. Sanders nodded and put her hands together. "Well," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I hardly know what to say." She leaned forward and picked up my exercise book with the greatest idea in the world drawn in it. "But what I can say is that Amit is very, very lucky to have friends who are so passionate about helping him find his family." Mrs. Khan nodded, and I saw the 2 police officers nodding too. "Now, Just to be clear, said Mrs. Sanders, peering over her glasses at us, what you did was extremely dangerous, and your plan, or the likes of it, must never, ever be attempted again. Do you understand? We all nodded silently. I could feel my cheeks getting hot, and I saw Tom's ears instantly turn bright red. You lied to Mrs. Khan, you left school without permission, and you put yourselves in great danger. Behaviour like this would usually lead to a temporary suspension from school. Josie gasped and Michael winced. I could hear Tom swallowing nervously, and even Ahmed looked scared. Mrs. Sanders went on. However, we've spoken with all your parents, and I can understand fully that you thought that this was an emergency. So, I looked up at Mrs. Sanders, and I could feel everybody doing the same. In this instance, you will not be suspended. Tom yelped a small yes, and Josie let out a huge puff of air that had been making her cheeks swell, and Michael gave a long sigh. And as soon as Mrs. Hemsley had told him what happened, Ahmet cheered and clapped. But even though I felt happy too, I couldn't feel fully happy because I still wanted to know something. And what about Ahmet's family, miss? Has the Queen found them already? Mrs. Sanders shook her head and slowly leaned forward. I think you should all know that the Queen, well, there are some things that even she can't do. But she's the Queen, frowned Tom. She can do whatever she wants. I could see Ahmet staring at Mrs. Sanders as if she wasn't making any sense to him either. But Mrs. Sanders was shaking her head. I'm afraid that's not quite true. I'm sure that the Queen would like to try and help Ahmet in some way, but I doubt very much she'll be allowed to send out extra people to find his family, especially when nobody knows where they are. On hearing Mrs. Sanders' words, I felt something hard hit me in the middle of my chest. I wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that the Queen could help anyone if she really wanted to, but even though my mouth opened, it couldn't say any words. I know that it may come as a huge disappointment, said Mrs. Sanders, peering over a glass at us and looking at me the longest. But Ahmet has lots of people trying to help him find his parents. Though, even if they do find them, it may take a long time, months, maybe even years before they can join him here. That's why he's staying with Miss York for now, she added, nodding at Ahmet's foster mother. We all stayed silent, and even though I didn't want them to, I could feel my eyes beginning to wet and my nose tickling and something heavy sinking into the pit of my stomach. Everything we had done had been for nothing, and the greatest idea in the world was really the stupidest idea in the world. In fact, it was probably the stupidest idea in the whole universe. And I knew that everyone was thinking it too. Now, said Mrs. Sanders kindly, I want to show you something. She took a newspaper from out of her bag and laid it on the desk in front of us. I looked over at Michael and Tom and Josie, but I think they must have all forgotten about the promise we made, because they immediately started to read the paper. So I wiped my eyes and I looked at it too. I knew that it had to be okay to break a promise to your mum if your head teacher was telling you to. A huge headline stared up at us from the front page, and alongside it was a large blurry image of me running up to one of the Queen's guards with Tom behind me. I could tell it was me because of my bright blue rucksack, but I couldn't see my face properly at all. The paper looked like this. So it says, London News, who is Ahmet and how can we help? The story said that the newspaper was going to run an international appeal to find Ahmet's parents, which made Josie grin and whisper, see? This is what it said. Yesterday afternoon saw a centuries-old tradition in disarray, when the changing of the guard ceremony was disrupted by two 9-year-old children. Breaking through the barriers, they attempted to give one of Her Majesty's palace guards a written note, asking the Queen to help them find the family of a refugee boy known as Ahmet. The decisive actions of these children have served to remind us about all the shameful hesitancy and fear which often govern our actions, and those of our government too. So, who is Ahmet, and where is his family? The paper is determined to help and urges our readers, our leaders and our politicians to do what they can to not only find this young boy's missing family, but reunite them here on UK soil. Perhaps it's the actions of these children which will inspire political bodies across the world to finally heed the plight of refugee children everywhere. A fitting testament indeed to a young boy whose story we have yet to learn, made him famous by a daring act of true friendship. We appeal to all of you to not only let the brave actions of these children be in vain, help us find Amit's family. After she had finished, Mrs. Khan put the paper down and looked at us with her eyebrows raised. So, you see, she said, clasping her hands together and placing them under her chin, all is not lost. Even if the Queen can't do as much as she'd like to, there is a whole world of people whispering Amit's name and trying to think about how to help him. Later that evening, as I sat in lessons, I thought about what Mrs. Sanders had said. I thought about the worldwide whispers being whispered right at that very moment, and wondered how long it would take for all of them to reach the Bordergate people, and Amit's mum and dad too. I had never thought about how loud a whisper can be if there are lots and lots of them. So all that day I whispered, "Help Amit," out loud too, wherever I could. So did Tom and Michael and Josie. And wherever we did it together, our whispers made a sound like an ocean. So we're going to move on to chapter 23, which is Brendan the Bully and the breaking news. Ooh. There are some days that you never, ever want to forget, like birthdays, school trips, and venture days. And there are other days when you want to forget everything that ever happened. Like when a bully bullies you, or a grown-up tells you off for something you didn't even do. Or when you love someone the most in the world suddenly dies. And then there are roller coaster days. Those are the days where one moment you feel so happy that you feel like it's your birthday, but then the next you feel so sad that you want to hide in your bed until everything is over. That Friday, the day after we had learnt about the worldwide whispers, was a roller coaster day. After the morning register, Mrs. Khan suddenly told everyone to leave their things on their desk because we had to go to an emergency school assembly. We only ever had an emergency assembly if something bad has happened, like a fight, or if something was stolen from a teacher. But Josie clapped her hands and asked, "Do you think they have found Amit's parents already?" That made my heart leap up and feel like it was flying. Maybe the emergency assembly was for that. So I looked over at Amit and gave him an excited wave. But the assembly wasn't for that at all. Mrs. Sanders only wanted to tell everyone to be on their best behaviour, even the teachers. Because the reporters surrounding the school were clearly not going anywhere anytime soon, and had put the school firmly on the world's radar. Hearing this made everybody sit up straight, just in case there was a giant radar being beamed down from outer space to spy on us. Then Mrs. Sanders said that if anyone spoke to a reporter about me or Tom or Amit or asked any of us any questions about what happened, the police would know. And they might be expelled. This made everyone turn round and stare at us, and I can hear Jenny saying loudly, "See, told you it was true, they did break into the Queen's house." And someone else reply, "They should have worn a mask, then they wouldn't have been caught." But we didn't mind, and Josie and Tom even started acting like famous people and began waving at everyone. But as we were leaving the assembly hall, Brendan the Bully pushed past us and whispered, "Smelly refugee bag," at Amit, and Chris and Liam punched their fists into their hands, which meant they were going to beat us up. I thought we should tell Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Sanders right away, but Amit told me not to. He said bullies that just talk are better than bullies that actually punch because words don't hurt as much. I don't agree. Dad always used to say that words can hurt more than punches because when you get a bruise or a bump, it goes away and you forget about it. But words stick around for a long time, and the meanest words stick around for the longest. Tom didn't think Amit was right either, and said we should pull down Brendan the Bully's pants in PE. Josie thought we should save up all our pocket money and pay one of the bigger bullies to bully him for us. But then Michael said that bullying a bully was silly and that we should just ignore him, so that's what we all agreed to do. except we couldn't. Because at first break, Brendan the bully started to do something that made me hate him more than anything I had ever hated in my life. Even Beetroot and Mr. Irons, Mrs. Khan says we should never ever hate anyone because hating someone can eat up your insides and give you heart disease. But sometimes you can't help it, and I especially couldn't help it when I heard Brendan the bully and Liam and Chris singing the song they made up. The song went like this. Ahmet the refugee smells like poo, so we're going to stuff him in a bag and flush him down the loo. I got so angry as soon as I heard it, I shouted at them to shut up and leave Ahmet alone. And so did Michael and Josie and Tom, but that only made them sing it louder and louder and louder, which made Ahmet's face get redder and redder. I looked around for a teacher to tell, but Mr. Irons was the only teacher I could see on duty, and I could see right away that he heard Brendan the bully's song too, and wasn't going to do anything about it. He just stood there and watched with his nose in the air. By the time Brendan the bully had begun to sing for the fourth time, I think all of us had forgotten what Mrs. Sanders said about everyone being on their best behaviour, and the giant radar, and those of reporters everywhere. Because suddenly, without even thinking about it, I made a running lunge for Brendan the bully, and Tom and Josie and Michael did the same. We all crashed into each other, falling to the floor, began punching and kicking Brendan the bully and Liam and Chris just as hard as we could. I think I might have been punched and kicked too, but I was so angry, couldn't feel anything. Ahmet stood frozen to the floor and watched us, not knowing what to do, but after a few seconds, he roared and jumped on top of Brendan the bully, began to hit him as hard as he could. The fight didn't last for more than a minute because a few seconds after we had fallen to the floor, we could hear a whistle hurrying our way and clicking noises like camera buttons being pressed, and a lots of pair of hands started pulling us away. We were marched into school and up the stairs, and the next thing I knew, we were all standing in Mrs. Sanders' office, being stared at angrily by not only Mrs. Sanders, but Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hemsley too. I couldn't really hear what they were saying because my ears had become so hot, but I think I heard the words ashamed, never in my history in school, and parents being said. We all got detention for fighting, even Ahmet. But it wasn't all that bad. When my ears had cooled down, Josie told me that when Mrs. Sanders had heard Brendan the bully's song, she had given him and Liam and Chris 2 weeks detention and said she would be calling their parents too. But as it turned out, Brendan the bully's punishment was far more serious than even we could imagine. Because by that very evening, Brendan the bully and Mr. Irons were breaking the news. On every single channel and in all the weekend papers, headlines like "Video of bully attacking refugee boy sparks outrage" and "Teacher stands aside as school bully threatens refugee boy" and "School bully trash talks refugee child" were everywhere. So that by Monday morning, the school was surrounded by even more cameras and reporters and vans with satellite dishes on their roofs than ever before. Brendan the bully and Liam and Chris didn't come into school for 3 whole days after they had broken the news. And when they did, their parents came with them and made them apologise to Ahmet in front of everyone at the morning assembly. They still had to do detention every day for 2 weeks. It made everyone glad that they had been caught by the news people. Brendan the bully still looked at Ahmet with a horrible scowl on his face whenever he thought no one could see him. And the one time in the lunch hall, he walked right up to Ahmet with his fist clenched, as if he wanted to punch him. But instead of being scared, Ahmet just looked at him with his lion eyes and grinned. After that, Brendan the bully never went near Ahmet again, and just when we thought things couldn't get any better, that week Mr. Irons and his whistling nose disappeared too and were never heard of again. Boring Miss Stevens had to take over his class, which probably made them just as miserable as they were before. But no one else really cared about that because now everyone was free to scream and laugh and shout as much as they wanted at break times again. So we did, except we all screamed and laughed and shouted louder and longer and harder than we had ever done before. Because when you're playing with your friends and don't have bullies to worry about, that's exactly what you should be doing. Okay, so next time I will upload a video, we'll be doing chapter 24, which is called The Interview. I hope you enjoyed today. I will make sure the videos are a bit shorter because I'll do them on a daily basis rather than fitting 2 days into one. I hope you have an amazing weekend, and I'll see you next week refreshed and ready. Okay, bye Emma.